Welcome everyone to this evening's meeting of the North Staffs branch of the Classical Association. Cold evening, so I hope the ether is not chilled in the way that things are chilly here. I'm very pleased this evening to welcome Fiona Haarer here from King's London, and a nice reminder, I think, for those of us who like the late Roman world, that Romans don't stop with Augustus or even Nero, but go on an awful lot later. Perhaps when we talk about Augustus and Nero, we should think about the ladies, Livia and Agrippina as well, because Fiona is here tonight to talk about perhaps the most famous of all female figures in the Roman world, the Empress Theodora, and I'm told that she's working on a new version of Procopius' Secret History, which will give us some juicy details about Theodora, and maybe she'll be sharing some of those with us tonight. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Fiona.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to have hello. Yes, I'm going to tell you about the Empress Theodora. So I've no idea, unless there's anything, feel free to interrupt. Well, I don't know if that would do anything to the live stream, but feel free to interrupt and ask questions if you want. So Theodora was married to the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. He reigned in the 6th century AD in Constantinople. He came to the throne in 527 and he died in 565. And we know a lot about his wife Theodora, mainly from one of the contemporary sources, and I'm going to be talking a lot about her later. But first, I'm just going to, the thing that everyone knows about Theodora is that she came from a very humble, slightly dubious background, and then she rose up to become the empress. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the legends behind her first. Yes, so there are quite a lot of academic books that have been written about Theodora. In fact, the first one that we have was published back in 1904 by a French scholar, Charles Deal, Theodora, Imperatrice de Byzance, published in Paris. And then we have this book by Anthony Bridge, Theodora, Portrait in a Byzantine Landscape, published in 1978. We have a couple of books by an American scholar, J.A.S. Evans, and this one, The Empress Theodora, Partner of Justinian, published in 2002, and another one, The Power Game in Byzantium, Antonina and the Empress Theodora, published in 2011. And with this one, I put up the front cover, but also a sort of a bit of the blurb. And in these ones, you can see that although this is an academic book, but there's a sort of a flavour about Theodora. So it's a fascinating exploration of the corridors of power in Byzantium. It reveals how Theodora and Antonina, I'll mention her later, both alumni of the theatre, remarkable examples of social mobility, moving into positions of power and influence, becoming wives of key figures. She has three aims: to protect Christians, I'll explain some of this later, to advance the careers of her family and friends, and to defend the poor and assist the defenceless, and in particular women. But there's a bit about the allure of power and the exercise of power. She loved authority, made and unmade marriage contracts. She appointed men to office or destroyed them if they got in her way. So that's a sort of a little bit of a flavour of her. And then we have another academic book. This one, Theodora, Empress of Byzantium, The Extraordinary Story of the Empress Theodora, a burlesque actress who married Justinian and became one of history's most important women, been much mythologized since the scandalous secret history of Procopius. So it is based on research into the contradictory and literary historical texts, etc., how she created her own unique identity and saved Justinian's empire through her wisdom and counsel. So that's the blurb of another sort of academic book about Theodora. But we also have a number of novels that sort of build on that kind of side of Theodora. So this one, Julian Bradshaw, The Bearkeeper's Daughter, a complex and historically rich novel of Imperial Byzantium. The Bearkeeper's Daughter features an empress whose beauty and power rivals Cleopatra's. This one with this slightly salacious book cover, Theodora, actress, empress, Paul. So we have this, her salacious stage act, maligning her as ruthless and power hungry. So who was this woman, etc. And ending off, it's a sexy, captivating novel that resurrects an extraordinary, little-known figure from the dusty pages of history. So that the book cover is far from any dusty pages of history. Another one by Stephanie Thompson, The Secret History, a novel of the Empress Theodora. Where Theodora went, trouble followed, and she defied convention, all the odds, rose from being a common theatre top to the empress of a great kingdom, the most powerful woman the Roman Empire would ever know. That behind the image was a scrappy, clever, conniving, flesh and blood woman full of sensuality and spirit, whose real story is as surprising as any ever told, etc. So that's a little flavour of the novels that have been written about Theodora. And this is actually the poster for an opera. Now this was based on a play by the playwright Victorian Sardou, who lived 1831 to 1908. He wrote many plays for the actress Sarah Bernhardt, including Theodora. It was first staged in Paris in December 1884. He told a story about how Theodora had a lover and was strangled on Justinian's order, which is completely made up. Nothing like that ever happened. But there were over 250 performances of this play, followed by a world tour. There was a revival in 1902, multiple imitations on stage and later film, and then it was adapted into this opera, and we have the picture, the poster. So where do we get all this evidence? Is it about her sort of salacious background? Is it all made up? Now, the evidence that we have about Theodora comes mainly from the historian Procopius, who was in the 6th century. He acted as a sort of legal secretary to Justinian's very famous general, who was called Belisarius. And Procopius accompanied Belisarius on many of the campaigns that were fought at the beginning of Justinian's reign. So he had a very sort of first-hand view of the empire, and then he spent the rest of his life in Constantinople. He wrote 3 works. One was a history of the wars that Justinian fought in Persia, in North Africa, and in Italy. It's basically a history, a bit like a sort of classical history with something like Thucydides or Herodotus would have written, very sort of classical in tone. Theodora appears in the wars, but only on a couple of occasions. Procopius' second work is about the buildings of Justinian's reign, which is basically a catalogue of a lot of the buildings or fortifications that were built during Justinian's reign. Some of it is very detailed, so there are some very detailed descriptions. Some of it is like a catalogue, a list of defences or aqueducts or towns. When he wrote that, by the time he wrote that, Theodora had died, and so she doesn't really appear in that. But the third work that Procopius wrote, which is really his most sort of well-known work today in a way, is The Secret History, which Procopius wrote during the lifetime, of course, of Justinian and Theodora, but because it was so critical of them and so scandalous, he couldn't publish it at the time. And in fact, it wasn't published until 1623, when it was discovered by the Vatican librarian, Niccolo Alemani. And when it was found, no one could believe that it had been written by the same person who had written the wars and the buildings, and there was a lot of debate about could it possibly be the same author, but it is pretty much agreed now that Procopius was responsible for all of these works. And in The Secret History, Procopius really targets Justinian and Theodora, and I mentioned Belisarius, the general, and Belisarius is his wife Antonina, who already thought we mentioned in some of those blurbs. And The Secret History reveals that Theodora's father had been the bear keeper, I'll come back to that in a minute, in the Hippodrome, and Theodora a burlesque queen, using the language that we've already seen. And women in the theatre at that time were considered sort of harlots, courtesans. They had a very low reputation. And Procopius's hatred of Theodora, really, it's partly this kind of male chauvinism against a very powerful woman who'd sort of risen up, but mainly the fact that Procopius really despised the fact that she had had these very lowly origins, but then had managed to rise up. And really what Procopius is thinking of is that he thought it irresponsible in a way that Justinian married a woman, this kind of a woman, and there were lots of other really sort of high-ranking women in this period that really would be more suitable to become the wife of an emperor. And I'm going to mention a few of these. This is a marble bust of a lady called Anicia Juliana. And she is the granddaughter of one of the emperors of the West, Valentinian III. And Anicia Juliana married one of the generals in Constantinople, a man called Ariovinus. He was a general. He became a consul in Constantinople. They had a son. Their son also became a consul, and their son married into the family of the previous emperor, Anastasius. So this is an example of a portrait bust of her. She's very cultured and a very educated lady. She was known as a sort of a donor, and this is the front cover of an illuminated and illustrated manuscript in Vienna, which is known as the Vienna Dioscorides. It's the earliest, one of the earliest and most lavishly illuminated manuscript, meaning they must have been very expensive, and it shows that Anicia Juliana was a sort of a patron of the arts. You can see three figures on the front. She is the middle figure, and she has on one side the personification of magnanimity, and on the other side prudence, and there's a little figure here and this little figure down here, is a sort of allegory of the gratitude of the arts, and there's an inscription running around it which describes Anicia Juliana as a patron of the arts. Another example of Anicia Juliana's sort of piety and donations is that she is known to be a builder of churches, and she constructed at least 3 big churches in Constantinople, and the most grand of these churches is the Church of St. Polyeuctus. Now, the Church of St. Polyeuctus, of which that is a picture of what it looks like today in Istanbul, You can see that's like the central hour. It would have been nearly as grand as Hagia Sophia if you've been to Istanbul and seen Hagia Sophia. Obviously, it's ruined now, but it shows again that she had a lot of money, she had a lot of influence, and she was obviously very sort of dedicated to this idea of kind of church building. Inside the church, obviously not there now, but there would have been an inscription running all the way around the inside of the church, and this inscription was written down and it was preserved in a work that we know today as the Greek mythology, the Mythologia Graeca. And we can see that it's honouring Juliana, and it's sort of mentioning her family, the fact that she's a royal princess, and she's descended from a previous empress, Theodosia, and she raised a small temple to its present size and beauty. Just to give you a little idea, we have a few remains of this inscription, which are in the museum, the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul. So I've just given you a couple of examples, so you can see there, you can see the inscription sort of running along it there. I've put up the museum plaque, and this bit says, "The inhabitants of the whole world, sing your works which are eternally remembered." It's all about being remembered forever. And we have another bit, and you can see how fine the carving is, see how beautiful the lettering is. Not even yourself know how many houses dedicated to God your hand has made. So you can get an idea of this kind of what a beautiful building it would have been. Now, so she is an example of, a sort of a contrasting figure. So you've got sort of Theodora raised up in the Hippodrome, with his terrible parts, and then you've got someone like Lucy Juliana, who Justinian, in fact, saw as a bit of a threat to his own reign. Now, another lady who Theodora might be compared with is Ariadne. Now, Ariadne was the daughter of the Emperor Leo, who reigned in the 5th century, and she went on to marry the Emperor Zeno. Zeno died. When Zeno died, she then went on to marry his successor Anastasia. So she was a daughter of an emperor and the wife of 2 successive emperors. And unlike Theodora, who never appeared on a coin, you can see Ariadne appearing on this lovely coin. And we also have some other depictions of Ariadne in these lovely ivory diptychs. And we also have another marble portrait head of Ariadne. So she's another lady who Theodora could be compared with unfavourably. Now, this type of portrait, we have a number of different sorts of portraits, and this one, which is obviously similar, this one is another lady that Theodora might be compared with. This is a picture of the Gothic queen called Amalasuntha, and Amalasuntha was the daughter of the Gothic king Theodoric, who was the king of Italy, and Theodoric ruled Italy for many years, and he was succeeded by Amalasuntha's son. The throne didn't pass to her, it passed to her son, Athalaric. There was a lot of dissension, and the story is that Athalaric had his mother Amalasuntha murdered in the bath on an island somewhere in Italy. There's another story that Theodora felt that Amalasuntha, beautiful, educated, cultured queen in Italy, was a threat to her, and that maybe Theodora was somehow responsible. There are some Western sources that credit Theodora with Amal's first murder, but we don't know if that's true or not. So that's a bit of scene setting. So I've been talking all the time about Theodora's early life from the Hippodrome, and how did she get from the Hippodrome, from this, very poor background, to marrying Justinian. So here are my holiday stats off the Hippodrome, just to remind you what it looks like today. This is a place of chariot racing mainly, but in between the chariot racing there's lots of other entertainments going on, theatre performances, that kind of thing. As I mentioned before, Theodora's father was a bear keeper, and he was the bear keeper for what we know as one of the factions. So you've got to imagine there are these different chariot racing sort of teams, if you want to think of them like that, and they were supported by different factions. There were 4 factions. The blues and the greens were the main ones. There was also the whites and the reds. Sometimes people make a sort of a little comparison today between sort of football teams and supporters, and there's a lot of bad behaviour going on, so there's a lot of comparing sort of football hooliganism and these chariot racing supporters. But so Theodora's father was the bearkeeper for the green faction, but he died when they were quite young, and Theodora's mother hastily remarried, and her new partner subsequently became the bearkeeper. So the bearkeeper is a bit of a theme. So the blue faction, and because the blue faction had sort of looked after the family in that way, Theodora became a big supporter of the blue faction. And the factions, although as I say they were basically to do with the chariot teams, but they did have a kind of political and sometimes religious allegiance. So they could become important in sort of Constantinopolitan politics, so it did matter. Now, so Theodora gets this kind of job as a kind of actress in the Hippodrome, very low kind of strata of society, very much disapproved of by the church. She eventually sort of manages to get herself out of this role in the theatre by becoming mistress of a governor who's called Epibolus, and he went off to be the governor in Africa, so she travelled with him to Libya, and got to Alexandria where he just discarded her. So Keele is left in Alexandria pretty much on her own, and here she has this sort of slightly religious conversion. And I'll come back to this later, but she converts to a type of Christianity which they call Neophysitism. Remember the word Neophysitism because I'll mention it later. Anyway, she's in Alexandria. She manages to make her way back from Alexandria, Antioch, eventually back to Constantinople, where she somehow meets Justinian. We don't know how. Was it because he saw her in the Hippodrome, or how did they meet? Anyway, they met, and Justinian wanted to get married to her, but there were 2 obstacles. The first obstacle was a law. There was a law that forbade a marriage between senators and actresses. So Justinian had to persuade his uncle Justin, who was the current emperor, to make a new law which allowed actresses to repent and then get married to someone of high status. The second strand of disapproval came from Justin's wife, Euphemia, who completely disapproved of Theodora, but she died in 524. And so in 525 they were able to get married. By this time Justin's uncle was getting a bit older. They became joint emperors in 527, and then Justinian and Theodora became a ruling couple, and Justine died. just because I wanted to give you a flavour of kind of their life. I can't show you, they would have lived in the Great Palace in Constantinople, but the Great Palace in Constantinople is on this site here, kind of by this sort of market and restaurant next to the Dome. You can see the Blue Mosque sort of poking up behind. But what you can see is, if you want to imagine Justinian and Theodora living a lovely life in the Imperial Palace, here are some of the floor mosaics which would have decorated the palace at the time, and these have all been excavated, and they've all been dated to around the sort of the 6th century. So they would have been there when Justinian and Theodora were living in the palace. We don't have, we know that there were some pictures of Justinian and Theodora inside the palace, because we've got some descriptions of them, but they don't survive. And so if we want to see some pictures, we have to go to the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, which I don't know if any of you have visited Ravenna. So this is the church of San Vitale, and in the church of San Vitale, in the sort of the main aisle, there are 2 panels facing one another, and on one side we have Justinian and his retinue there, and facing him on the other side we have Theodora. Obviously she's in the middle. Now she's sort of presented here as a kind of some kind of imperial donor or patron, and so she's holding in her hand here this communion chalice that she's presenting, and well, she's sort of offering it sort of in the direction of Christ. And she's also got, if you notice, on the hem of her cloak here, there's 3 little figures. They're not very clear here, but that's a depiction of the 3 magi bringing gifts. And so it's supposed to be a sort of mirroring. Theodora's giving a gift, and she's got these 3 magi on her cloak, sort of suggesting that this kind of gift giving to Christ. Now, what did she do when she was the empress? One of the things that she did, because it's thought that because she had this sort of poor kind of upbringing, she did actually have this kind of sort of sense of social justice. So, for example, she freed all of Constantinople's prostitutes by buying them from their sort of brothel keepers, giving the girls a set of clothes, giving them money, and sort of sending them off so that they could, live a more sort of wholesome life. So this was something that she did herself with her own sort of money. But we can see in the laws that obviously were passed by Justinian that there are quite a lot of laws that are passed to improve the condition of women. So there was a law that forbade women to be forced into a life living in the theatre. You can see why Theodora that would be important to Theodora. They removed the barriers for actresses marrying. Obviously, that the law had to be changed to allow them to marry. They changed the laws so that women were allowed to own property and to inherit. There were laws about dowries, and finally there was a law that women should not be put in jail in case they were molested by male guards, and if they needed to be confined, then they should be sent to a convent. So these kinds of laws, looking after the rights of women, obviously they're passed in Justinian's name, he's the emperor, but it's commonly believed that he was influenced by Theodora. Now, another thing that she did was that we saw that with Anicia Juliana how important building activity is, and giving donations. And there are lots of examples of Theodora being commemorated on buildings, both secular buildings and religious buildings, either because she herself gave donations or Justinian wanted to record her name. So we get lots of city walls, fortifications, baths, etc., where her name is inscribed on walls. We've got lots of examples of towns called Theodoropolis to honour her. We've got a story that we know from Procopius about how she went out to a place in Asia Minor, and she gave money to secure the road. She gave lots of money to the churches along the way, and Justinian sort of embellished all these places with aqueducts and baths and churches and so on. So all of this building activity was very important if you were an emperor, and if you were living in these places, obviously it was a sign of sort of imperial kind of largesse that you could see going on yourself. We also know that they gave lots of donations to individual churches. So they gave some very kind of precious cross to this church, which is the Church of St. Sergius. It's in Safa in Syria. Not really visitable today, sadly. And that picture was taken back in 1997 when I went there. It's an amazing site. There's a huge number of other churches there. Another place. This is Mount Sinai in Egypt, where that was really built by Justinian originally. And inside the church, there's one of the beams in the church has Theodora, and the name Theodora carved into it. This is a not very good picture, sorry, of Ephesus, but Justinian and Theodora were responsible for building the Church of St. John. You can sort of see the outline of it there. And we do have some of the capitals on the columns have got their monograms carved into it, and there are some inscriptions describing the fact that they were responsible. The idea of sort of inscribing initials into the capitals, we get that in quite a lot of churches, I couldn't show you a picture, but there's inside here. This is a church of Hagia Irene, which is in Constantinople. It's very close to Hagia Sophia. If you're walking towards the Topkapi Palace, sort of on the way, but it hasn't been open for years, sadly. Justinian was responsible for rebuilding that church in the 530s. Of course, we have the Hagia Sophia, which Justinian had to rebuild again in the 530s after the centre of Constantinople was burned down. I'll come back to the circumstances of that, and also just because if you're not familiar, some pictures of the inside of Hagia Sophia. This is a sort of a picture of the donors. We've got Constantine on this side presenting his city of Constantinople to Christ, and Justinian on the other presenting his the newly built Hagia Sophia to the Virgin in Christ there. Here's one of these lovely carved capitals with initials. Now, we've got some descriptions of, because obviously quite a lot of the bits inside Hagia Sophia are not really surviving now, but we've got some descriptions from people who wrote about it at the time. So there's a lovely poem by a poet called COURTESAN, who describes the altar and the altar cloth, and he describes how these were all embellished with the the deeds of Justinian and Theodora, and sort of they depicted the two of them together to show that how they were sort of the patrons of this church. And we also have another work by this person here, who's a writer of hymns. He's shown here lying down. He's called Romanos the Mellowed. This is a miniature from a much later manuscript. You've got Romanos, you've got the Virgin, and you can't see it very well, but she's actually got this scroll here. The idea was that Romanos came to Constantinople and had a dream in which the Virgin gave him a scroll and he swallowed it, and then he woke up and he wrote 800 hymns. Anyway, that's the story about him. But he wrote, most of his hymns are just sort of religious, but he wrote one in which was a response to the actual historical events of the 530s, the circumstances of the burning down of the centre of Constantinople, and the rebuilding of Hagia Sophia. And he wrote this hymn in which he credits Justinian and Theodora with the building of the church. He compares them with Constantine and Helen. And the idea was that, if you were in 6th century Constantinople, most of the people who were going to the church on a sort of weekly basis or whatever, they wouldn't be able to read the monograms, they wouldn't be able to read the inscriptions, but they would be able to listen to the hymns. So it was a way of communicating to a kind of mass audience and to get the message out that Justinian and Theodora were these kind of church patrons. And we also have, obviously most people know about Hagia Sophia, but we also have this little church which was the church of St. Sergius and Bacchus. It's sort of down the hill a little bit in Constantinople from the Hippodrome in Hagia Sophia, and sometimes it's known as the Little Hagia Sophia. And it's of course it's a mosque now. Here's the inside of it. It was built by Justinian and Theodora. It's really very ornately decorated. Here's another of its lovely capitals. And if you cast your mind back to the lovely inscription that we saw in St. Polyeuctus, with the inscription about Anicia Juliana, and there is it's still in situ in the mosque, this inscription that runs all the way around the interior. So here we have, I should have marked it up in red, but the whole of it it's really giving credit to Theodora. God, if you read down to the bottom, God crowned Theodora is highly adorned with piety, whose constant toil lies in unsparing efforts to nourish the destitute. So we really have come a long way from this idea of sort of Theodora as a kind of actress in a hippodrome to this kind of very kind of pious church building, worthy of sort of putting up these kinds of inscriptions. Now, I've been mentioning the burning down of the centre of Constantinople, and this arose from an episode in the 530s and 532 that we refer to as the Nika riot. If you think about those factions that I mentioned earlier, the Blues and the Greens, they were usually opposed to each other. But before the Nika riot happened, there had been some trouble in the Hippodrome in the centre of Constantinople, and Justinian had rounded up many of the ringleaders of these factions, and he was going to hang them, execute them. But what happened was that the scaffold on which they were going to be hung sort of broke, and one of the Green faction and one of the Blue faction escaped alive. And the Blues and the Greens came together and they asked Justinian to spare their lives. And Justinian said no. So there was a huge riot, and the mob broke into the prison. They freed everyone in there. They set fire to the prison. They set fire to the centre of Constantinople, the Senate House, Hagia Sophia, the great church, the predecessor of today's Hagia Sophia, the wooden seats in the Hippodrome. This is where the main street which was known as the Mezze in the 6th century, just to give you an idea of the geography, but basically all of that area. Some very famous bars in Constantinople, the bars of Zeuxippus, which were known for their beautiful classical statues. We have a lovely poem that talks about the statues around the bars. It's a bit of a statue that was left, but the bars of Zeuxippus were burnt to the ground. And yes, I mean all of this area of the Hippodrome. Eventually, Justinian sort of made a few concessions, but the rioting went on, and they ended up by proclaiming somebody as emperor in Justinian's stead, somebody called Hypatius, who was in fact the emperor of the nephew of the previous emperor Anastasius. And at that point, Justinian thought about fleeing. And it's at this point that we have in Coursera's Wars his mention of Theodora, and she gives this speech. Whether or not a woman should give an example of courage to men is neither here nor there. At a moment of desperate danger, one must do what one can. I think the fight, even if it brings us to safety, is not in our interest. Every man born to see the light of day will stand. But that one who has been emperor should become an exile I cannot bear. May I never be without the purple I wear, nor live to see the day when men do not call me your majesty. If you wish safety, my lord, that is an easy matter. We are rich, and there is the sea, and yonder our ships. But consider whether, if you reach safety, you may not desire to exchange that safety for death. As for me, I like the old saying that the purple is the noblest shroud. So she gives this stirring speech, and Justinian is convinced, and he sends in Belisarius and the army. They kill 35,000 in the Hippodrome. They arrest Hypatius and his brother and put them to death, and that's the end of the riot. That episode is obviously an instrumental turning point in the reign of Justinian for a lot of reasons, but for our purposes here, it's a sort of illustration of the character of Theodora, and many people see it as a sort of example of her kind of pride, and the idea that because she came from such humble background, she couldn't, having sort of reached this height, she couldn't bear the thought of sort of giving it up for any reason. So the very last bit that I want to talk about is Theodora and her role in the religious debate. Now this period of late antiquity, kind of 4th to the 6th century, it's a period where we've got lots of schisms in the church. And I mentioned at the beginning this word Miaphysite. And so at this point in the 6th century, there was a schism, a break between a group of people who were Miaphysites. That is, that they believed that Christ had one single nature. It was from the Greek mia, which is from one. Okay. The other people on the other side of the debate were known as duophysites, duo two in Greek. They believed that Christ had two natures, one divine, one human. Okay, and this division, which you might think, is it really that significant, was extremely significant. There was a church council in 451 at a place called Chalcedon, which was across the Bosphorus from Constantinople. And at that, the duophysites won the debate. So the duophysites are often known as the Chalcedonians, or the Orthodox. Okay, because if you're on the right side, then you're Orthodox and everyone else is wrong. Anyway, the empire is split because Rome, the Pope in Rome, Constantinople and some of the eastern provinces are all pro-Chalcedon. Okay, they're all Miaphysites. But the rest of the east and Egypt are all Miaphysites. And the big problem with Egypt was that it supplied the empire with grain, so you couldn't entirely offset it, because otherwise you'd be very hungry. Okay, so they had to be a way of keeping everyone happy. On the other hand, you don't want to upset the Pope either. Now, because Theodora was converted when she was in Alexandria, Egypt, that's why she became the Miaphysite. But Justinian, he's in Constantinople. He doesn't want to upset Italy and the Pope, no. He's got to be Chalcedonian, the Miaphysite. So, okay, the imperial couple are sort of on either side of the debate. Now, Theodora is quite active in her support of the Miaphysites. So you get all these sort of exiled, places where the debate is raging, one side or the other becomes the exiles. The Miaphysite, many of them came to Theodora's palace, the Palace of Holistas, and in fact that's all that survives of it today in Constantinople. It's quite near that little church of the little Hagia Sophia. It would have had a nice view over the Bosphorus, even though it's all remaining here. Anyway, it's thought that she brought a lot of Miaphysites to this palace here. We also got lots of examples of religious treaties that were written and dedicated to Theodora because people were really very grateful to her. And in the end, there was in the 540s a separate Miaphysite church that was founded especially in the eastern provinces of Egypt, and really this idea of the survival and the rise of Miaphysitism can be credited to Theodora's support. A lot of people have debated how could it be Justinian and Theodora, how could they hold such opposing views? Some people think that they didn't really hold opposing views, but they just pretended because it was a good way collectively they kept all the different parts of the empire happy. Other people think that they really did disagree. And one of the examples, and I just show this because it's slightly amusing in its own way, is that there were still in many parts of the empire groups of pagans in the 6th century. And towards the kind of sort of south of Egypt, there was a tribe called the Nobodai. And this tribe, who were pagan, they decided that they would convert. So they asked Theodora for some advice. And she said, that's okay, I'll send a missionary down. And so she said to Justinian, it's great, isn't it? This tribe, they want to convert to Christianity, I'll send a missionary. But Justinian said, no, don't you send a missionary, I want to send a missionary because I want to send a Chalcedonian missionary. I knew that Theodora would send a Miaphysite. So Justinian sends his own mission with all this gold and baptismal robes and all sorts. And then we get this account from John of Ephesus, a church historian. So Justinian sends off his embassy. When the Queen learned these things, she quickly, with much cunning, wrote letters to the Duke of the Theodine and sent a mandatory of her court to carry them to him, which were as follows. Inasmuch as both His Majesty and myself have decided to send an embassy to the Nobodai, I now dispatch you a blessed man named Julian. And it is, moreover, my will that my ambassador reach the aforesaid people before His Majesty's. You warn that if you permit his ambassador to arrive there before mine, do not hinder him by various pretexts until mine shall have reached you and pass through your province and arrived at his destination. Your life shall answer for it, for I will immediately send and take off your head. Anyway, and if you want to know what happened, the Duke, maybe not unsurprisingly, carried out Theodora's instructions, and her envoys arrived first, and they converted the king of the Nobodai, who then converted all these people, and the Justinian's embassy turned up and they rejected that. It's quite a rare example, I think, of when we know that Theodora deliberately went against Justinian's wishes, but maybe there were others we don't know. So I've just brought us back to Ravenna, and really to conclude that I hope that's a sort of a flavour of the life and rule of Theodora. We can see that she started life in this very lowly way. She managed to become empress, and really her early life sort of influenced how she lived her later life. Either it was because she had genuine concern about the plight of girls, the life of which she knew in the city, how she had converted to Christianity and sort of religious beliefs, and also how she felt about her own power and her own role in Constantinople, and how that was important to her. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Custom and practice is that we briefly pause to think about the future, so to speak. And the future for the rest of this calendar year is non-existent. Right? So the branch now ceases, and we all go off and enjoy Christmas and what have you. And we will not be back formally doing anything as a branch until March of the coming year. When we'll have a colleague of mine from the University of Manchester, Lindsay Shale, who'll be coming to talk about Egyptian ideas in Greco-Roman medicine. She's a medicine person. And we'll follow that up in April with a reading of Plautus's Mostralia, so about ghosts and such like. And we'll finally end up with John Drinkwater in May, who I hope is going to bring some specimens of Roman coins, and we can have a hands-on Roman coin session. So that's what the branch will be doing for the rest of its cycle. But this is the last of those meetings for this particular calendar year. I don't know whether the reading groups are meeting between now and Christmas.
Peggy says yes.
Peggy says yes. So,
yes, we're trying to catch up, of course, because it's like to have some time off for our hip branch.
right, okay,
So we are now double trying to get through a little in calendar.
Looking at, well, good stuff. I can't moan about that.
And the Greeks are still looking at all the things connected.
Right, so if anyone's on the ether who's in fact involved in those groups, I mean, I'm sure they know about this. If anyone wants to get involved, if they contact either Stephen or myself, we can put you in touch with Peter and see where things are going. After that, I think Fiona's kindly offered to field the old question, if there is a question. So could I ask if there are any questions for Fiona?
And just before anybody speaks, for those who are watching online, we can't hear you speak, but if you have a question, if you write it in comments, I will endeavour to pass it on.
Maybe I could start the ball rolling. So what you showed us was Procopius in a very positive way about Theodora. So she's the lady who puts backbone into Justinian when he's about to go off and what have you. So, what, to your way of thinking, I mean, why is there such an enormous, as you write, there's a dissonance between those historical works and the secret history,
Yes.
provoking this debate about whether in fact it's the pseudo Procopius and stuff like that. So what did they do to annoy him, or vice versa?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, I didn't show you all the terrible bits from the secret history. Yes. I mean, one of the things is that the dating of all the three works is not entirely secure. So originally you thought, well, at the beginning of the reign, everything was going really well, or as things often do at the beginning of people's reigns when people have just taken power. The wars went really well, and they started to go not so well. The buildings, we don't know, did Justinian it's a very beautiful word. The secret history. Now, there's been a lot of recent work done on that to trace, because on one hand it's so scurrilous, because Procopius just totally making it up, because it's divided up into these sort of terrible scenes about Theodora's early life, but then there's quite a lot about legal forms or social forms, things like that. I mean, he says, they took all the money away from the rich or things like that. Now, that sounds absolutely terrible. And a lot of people have done this work on looking at Justinian's laws and actually marrying up comments that Procopius makes in the secret history against actually what happened. And there is actually quite a lot of correlation going on. So now we think it's not totally made up. So why did Procopius disapprove? Procopius is quite traditional. He doesn't really like the idea of, and along with many senators, he doesn't really like the idea of an emperor like Justinian who, his uncle came from the Balkans and came to Constantinople and was in the army, rose up and became the emperor. Apparently Justin couldn't even write his name. He had to have a kind of stencil thing to write it. Justinian, of course, was brought up in Constantinople, so he did have a lovely classical education, but he wasn't coming from any kind of imperial or senatorial or consular background. So there's quite a lot of sort of dislike on Procopius and the old senatorial families part, this idea of Justinian, never mind Theodora's sort of background that wasn't really seen to be suitable to become emperor. And then a lot of the reforms that Justinian passed, he did a lot of sort of land tax reforms, and other financial reforms that were not altogether to the helpful to the senatorial or landowning farming kind of classes. So a lot of people didn't like him for those reasons, and you can see that sort of being mirrored in some of the other sources. And what happened with the riot, the Nika riot, you can see in Constantinople, obviously there's the idea of a kind of mob basically rampaging around, burning everything down. But what was the Senate doing? Actually, some of them would have been quite pleased if Justinian had got into his ship and sailed away with Theodora. They could have had Hypatius on the throne, Anastasius' nephew, nicer, imperial, head of family. Hypatius had been a general, altogether successful, but he'd been a general, so he was a much, and some people thought, more suitable ruler. So there's quite a lot of different sort of layers, and obviously Procopius is writing it. That's sort of the argument that he's not just writing a totally kind of scurrilous pamphlet that's got no basis in truth, that there are ways of sort of mapping some of what he says in the secret history onto Justinian's laws and into other sources that we found in the 6th century. There's another source about sort of government and reforms written by somebody called John the Lydian, who was a civil servant, and he hated Justinian because Justinian got rid of the use of Latin in the civil service, because it was a period of where Latin was becoming less used and Greek was becoming more used, but it's sort of barbaric really. And John the Lydian was somebody who knew his Latin well. And he hates Justinian because Justinian got rid of Latin. Justinian also got rid of the post of consul, ancient Roman, might do that. So all these kind of, it was seen as this kind of newfangled sort of things, and that's why one of the reasons why Procopius didn't like them, and that's a more sort of sensible reason than say he just didn't like Theodora because of her background.
So how come the book, the Secret History then wasn't published at the time, or was
Or
it?
to keep it secret. I mean, we think that he probably, he would have written it, and then maybe they would have passed it amongst sort of like-minded friends. They had these sort of literary circles. But there were a number of plots against Justinian, and especially towards the end of his reign, he became totally paranoid that people were plotting against him. And if the Secret History had obviously come to his attention, then that would be the end of Procopius. So it had to be definitely kept secret. But I mean, but there was Arius who was obviously did all this, was responsible for Justinian's military successes, because Justinian certainly never left Constantinople to go and fight any wars. It was those Arius and his generals that, Justinian became paranoid that Belisarius was going to somehow have a uprising. Obviously, he had the loyalty of some of the army. Unlike Justinian, really, he didn't have that connection as a general. And he got rid of Belisarius, and ended up there was novels about the downfall of Belisarius, really, and how he ended up as a sort of beggar on the streets after all his kind of service. Yeah.
Can you elaborate more on the language situation in Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire? Because Justinian is usually considered to be Latin-speaking, or rather than Greek-speaking by birth. He was born near Skopje, and in fact his only monument that I know exists is there, a relatively recent one. So how was Greek coexisting with Latin? You mentioned about this reform that eliminated Latin from the civil service, and also the time-honored tradition of having consuls. But still there is Latin would be used for 2 more centuries, one way or another, until Heraclius.
Yes, I mean it was still, yes, I mean basically, the sort of the eastern part of the empire was more Greek speaking.
Like always.
To start with. When you've got sort of the machinery of government, that was sort of done in Latin, so the government and the army basically would have used Latin predominantly. Justinian, yes, he would have originally, or Latin would have been what he had, but because he had an education in Constantinople, so he would have been fluent in Greek, so he would have had either. And it's just this sort of gradual sort of change over time during the 6th century that Greek sort of becomes more to the fore, and that they do stop using Latin within the civil service. They still would have used it in various bits in the army, of course, and then it's just this sort of very gradual sort of change over time. Now you do get there are some, most of the sources that we have for the 6th century that are the Eastern sources are in Greek, and then of course we have the Western sources which are in Latin, and then of course we have, so we have, but it's noticeable as at the turn of the 5th, 6th century, so even sort of just 20 years or so before this, you've got people writing in both Greek and Latin in Constantinople, and you've got an author called Christian who wrote in Latin, and he did all this sort of Latin grammar, and he wrote for the Emperor Anastasius. We've got 2 panegyrics, one by somebody called Procopius of Gaza, and Procopius of Gaza wrote this prose panegyric in Greek. Obviously he's much he's definitely, Christian is in Constantinople, he writes a panegyric in Latin, and so a lot of people say, well, you know, there's no point writing a panegyric of all things if no one can understand it. So people often use that as a sort of as an example. Obviously people still understood Latin and used it, otherwise it's pointless writing a working prose of an emperor in a language that no one can understand. So I mean, people at the beginning, you know, definitely still could understand and use Latin. It's just that it became a bit less common. And in terms of the Greek, you've got Procopius who's writing basically this very complicated classical Greek language, like Thucydides would have written, and he uses a lot of stuff which, you know, that the people in Constantinople in the 6th century would not have used in their everyday speech. So you've got this very classical manuscript, you've got some other sources. So there was somebody called Malalas who wrote this chronicle, which became a very popular genre of writing. And Malalas writes, when he gets to Justinian, he's writing basically the same history, but he writes in very sort of vernacular, colloquial Greek, which it still would have been complicated. I mean, the man on the street would really be able to read it, obviously, but it was much closer to the spoken. And then you've got somebody like Romanos who's writing these hymns. Well, you've got to be able to understand the hymns if you're going to go to church and hear them, otherwise it's pointless having a hymn, isn't it? But Romanos' Greek is quite difficult, you know. So again, if it, you know, it's not that everyone would be able to read it or anything, but they would be able to understand that. And then you've got a lot of people in between. But there was in Justinian's reign quite a group of people who wrote very classical, very difficult Greek language and very difficult Greek poems where they really wanted to show that they knew their classical Greek and they had a very nice classical Greek education and they could still write it.
In the legal compilations that we relate to Justinian, they were in Latin, and then translated into Greek.
Some bits, but some of them were in Latin, but then the novels, the laws. I mean, the sort of one of the most interesting things about the Justinian's novels, the new laws that he passed, is that there are these prophecies in Greek which sort of explain the mindset of Justinian. So sort of read that about why he wanted to pass the law, and then you read, and then you've got the law. But the prefaces, a lot of people use as sort of, you know, cultural, historical evidence for the time because it sort of shows what Justinian. I mean, they were written by Justinian's legal secretary Tribonian, who was the great ruler, but who in fact got caught up in the Machiavelli, and Justinian had to demote him for a bit because he was very unpopular Tribonian, but he was a great lawyer.
How did the church receive Theodora? Because you mentioned her more than flirtation with heresy, and yet here she is donating things and such like. So does she go down in later church chronicles as a good person, a person who cherishes the church, or is she a dangerous temptation for her husband?
Well, it depends who you're reading. I mean, if you're reading Orthodox Chalcedonian historian's account, it's terrible. If you're reading Miaphysite, she's a saint.
And today, if you went to Greece, would you find an icon of Theodora, or is that a complete no?
Not really. Not like that, no.
But did you say she was a saint in the Orthodox Church?
In the Miaphysite Church, yes. I mean, they love her.
This is an Orthodox,
Well, this
Catholic Orthodox.
This is Ravenna, and this is slightly complicated because Ravenna had to be taken back by by the Eastern Roman Empire, and I mean, Justinian fought a war against the Ostrogoths, and eventually to take back Italy from Europe, even though in fact they'd been asked to go and rule Italy, but anyway, Justinian fought a war to take it back, and it went, it lasted for decades. But in the 540s, Belisarius managed to take back Ravenna, and they had a number of churches and tombs for Theodoric and the Ostrogoths, and then they were sort of related. This was portrait that was painted by a banker, whose name was Julian, and I'm not sure we really know very much about why he did that. I mean, it's also Justinian and Theodora certainly never went there. I mean, apart from on 1 or 2 occasions, they never set foot out of Constantinople. So they didn't know, but this was done sort of slightly separate. I mean, there were all sorts of arguments about why it came into being. But I mean, it's not, and it's definitely not an example of Justinian's direct patronage, because he wasn't there. If it had been in Constantinople, yes.
But it is so splendid, this surviving some say over-restored mosaics, but Ravenna is sadly on one level it's kind of passed by the tourists. It's not such a great tourist destination like some others. But these churches, Santa Columana Nuova and San Vitale, and also Theodoric's, it's absolutely. There is also this Gothic Aryan sort of layer which one can detect, and some of the churches were originally Aryan.
That's right. Then they had to be sort of converted.
Like the one you mentioned, Saint Irene, it has a very interesting iconoclastic cross, golden, and it was actually accessible in 2019. Very pricey for seeing very little. But that is how Turkish museums operate.
If I can ask you a lightweight question. The headdress that the daughters wear, is that equivalent ground? Is it the status? Or is the hat?
No, I mean it is, and obviously it's got so many sort of jewels and to convey a sort of treasures and importance. I mean, interestingly, a lot of people make. I mean, I mentioned these magi on the pen. A lot of people make a lot of that because it's actually very much influenced by kind of Persian sort of design, and a lot of people have written about the influence, even though Persia and Constantinople were at war, but quite a bit of Justinian's reign. There was a lot of cultural exchange, and a lot of people have looked at that as also, for example, this kind of cultural exchange in their village. It's kind of amusing that kind of what we go to from there.
You mentioned quite a lot about the books, both research-wise and novels, Theodora. What can you say about Justinian and Theodora in film? I know of one 1960s epic which was West German Italian. Absolutely amazing, sort of really a grand thing. At that time, and it depicted Belisarius, Narses, and Theodora and Justinian, and also showed the killing of Amalasuntha in the back.
Oh right, yes.
I suppose because it was in German and Italian, it didn't make much to Britain.
Yes. confess I didn't really know that much about films. So, yeah.
But this, I think this is the only one that I know of. But
Yeah.
it was a really grand thing, sort of like 3 hours, I think.
Wow.
So very large. I have to dig it up for you. It had something. The Roman Empire was in the title. I thought that it was called the passing of the Roman Empire or something like that. But I'll dig up the title and I'll pass it around because it's.
If you let me, I'll pass it around everyone here.
Yeah. I was looking it up for DVD of the film, but I think it's available in German. If I remember correctly.
Have you read Robert Grady's Count Bella's Irish?
Yeah.
Yes, not very carefully, but yes.
Because that's it's very well written.
Does Gibbon say much about Theodora?
Nothing helpful.
Well, perhaps on that note, and unlike Gibbon, we've had quite a lot of very helpful stuff this evening, so I'd like to thank Fiona again very much for coming to talk to us on a neglected topic, I think. The later Roman Empire deserves a little bit more publicity than it gets, so it's nice to have had this meeting this evening. So thank you very much for coming up, Fiona. We've all, I think, thoroughly enjoyed this evening, so thank you. And I'd just like to close in thanking Fiona in the traditional way.